Hello, 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 and welcome back to another episode of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup, and today we're going to dive into the changes in patient demographics at Ionia State Hospital over the decades. More specifically, we're going to take a look at two major changes that occurred during the 1960s. First, how schizophrenia gained notoriety as a violent disease, and second, how schizophrenia became a primarily Black disease. Now, as I mentioned last week, this is a very heavy topic, but it's extremely important to talk about because it's often been overlooked or just plain ignored. Now, I'll admit that I'm not an expert when it comes to discussing racial issues in the US. I will do my best to address these issues fairly, but it's entirely possible that I may mess up or misspeak along the way. So I want to approach this topic with humility, as there are far more people who are better equipped to speak on it. But this is something that is very important, not only to the history of mental health in the United States, but also to society today. And this will be a fairly dense episode in terms of information. I have lots of dates and names and places, so feel free to check out the transcript if that helps you follow along. I've also included my sources in the transcript for this episode. Most of my information comes from the book, The Protest Psychosis by Jonathan M. Metzl, and I'll direct you to that book for a clearer and more thorough examination of this topic than I'm able to provide in a 40-minute podcast. Consider this a crash course in the racialization of mental illness in psychiatric hospitals, not an in-depth study. Trigger warnings for this episode include racialized topics, outdated and inappropriate language, mention of physical brutality, and gaslighting of people of color. These are uncomfortable topics. If you feel inclined to turn off the episode, I gently encourage you to listen or to return when you have the bandwidth to do so, and to wrestle with what makes you feel uncomfortable. There are stories that I'll tell that I wish hadn't happened, and I don't like hearing them or telling them because of how people were treated. And I may mention some things that you disagree with because of your lived experience, but I challenge you to think of how your experience may be very different from someone else's lived experiences. These issues are complicated and complex, and they exist in shades of gray. Nonetheless, they are important to bring to light and important to share with others. So come on in and get as comfortable as possible as we go behind the walls of Ionia State Hospital. In order to adequately address the way that schizophrenia became a Black disease, we have to go back in time, even before the American Civil War, when psychiatry was in its infancy. In 1851, Millard Fillmore was president of the United States, and the nation was being divided by the issue of slavery. Slaves, of course, were seen by many as less than human, and they were indelibly tied to their owners until they were sold or until they died. But did slaves have mental illnesses? American surgeon Samuel Cartwright wrote in the New Orleans Medical and Surgical Journal in 1851 that slaves who ran away from their masters had a treatable medical disorder. Cartwright coined the term drapetomania, which comes from the Greek runaway plus madness, saying this occurred when, quote, the white man attempts to oppose the deity's will by trying to make the Negro anything else than the submissive knee bender, which the Almighty declared he should be, by trying to raise him to a level with himself, or by putting himself on an equality with the Negro, end quote. So stay with me here because I find this passage confusing. It seems to be saying that drapetomania occurs when white masters attempt to elevate Black folks to their level, but it's the Black folks who get pathologized and get the diagnosis because they are the ones compelled to run away. Now, other sources indicate that the conditions of slavery were such an improvement upon the lives slaves otherwise would have had that attempting to flee would be some kind of insanity. I mean, Really? Who would want to leave such luxury? Cartwright also coined the term dysesthesia aethiopus, which meant, quote, rascality and disrespect for the master's property that resulted when African Americans did not have whites overseeing their every action. Cartwright theorized that both conditions, drapetomania and dysesthesia aethiopus, resulted from biological lesions, and he advised treating both with whipping, hard labor, and in extreme cases, amputation of the toes, end quote. So in other words, this condition was biologically based and therefore could only be cured by means of physical punishment. After slavery had been abolished, Black folks were left in a strange position. They weren't accepted in white society, so when they tried to integrate into mainstream society, many were pathologized for not meeting expectations. Writer W.E.B. Du Bois described in his 1897 Atlantic Magazine essay, quote, the two-ness of being an American and a Negro, two warring ideas in one dark body, whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder, end quote. And this excerpt shows how Black folks wrestled with their dual identities, which was something that would follow them well into the 20th century, if not into the 21st century. In previous episodes, we've talked about dementia praecox as the original term for schizophrenia. It was coined by German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin, who, interestingly enough, believed that dementia praecox afflicted all people equally, regardless of gender or race. But as there tends to be, someone wasn't so sure about that assessment. In the early 1900s, Dr. Era Everts, a psychiatrist from the Government Hospital for the Insane in Washington, D.C., wrote an article entitled Dementia Praecox in the Colored Race, in which she described the dramatic increases in the illness in, quote, colored patients. So Dr. Everts attempted to explain why she believed Black folks were struggling with mental illness after slavery ended. Her argument was this, and my apologies for the language she uses. Quote, this bondage, being slavery, in reality was a wonderful aid to the colored man. The necessity of mental initiative was never his, and his racial characteristic of imitation carried him far on the road. But after he became a free man, the conditions under which he must continue his progress became infinitely harder. He must now think for himself and exercise forethought if he and his family are to live at all. Two things which have so far not been demanded and for which there was no racial preparation. It's been said by many observers whose words can scarce be doubted that a crazy Negro was a rare sight before emancipation. However that may be, we know he is by no means rare today, end quote. So just to summarize, she's saying that former slaves weren't created to think for themselves. So that's why they're struggling with mental illness post-slavery. It's just really heartbreaking and infuriating to think that a doctor once believed that, and a woman doctor at that. You'd think she would understand at least a little fraction of how difficult it is to assimilate into a white, male-dominated society. The diagnosis of dementia praecox was still in use in the US when the term schizophrenia came over from Europe. It had been coined by Swiss psychiatrist Paul-Eugen Bleuler and meant split mind. Bleuler saw dementia praecox and schizophrenia as two different phenomena. According to him, the underlying mechanism of dementia praecox was a loosening of associations, where people lived not in reality, but in their own fantasies. This would include people struggling with paranoia or fear of others, as well as what we would call today dissociation. This is a very common symptom of trauma, where a person sort of checks out, if you will, or disconnects with their environment in order to feel safe. Bleuler saw schizophrenia as more of an emotional splitting with symptoms like indifference, creativity, passion, even fanaticism. Quote, psychiatrists described patients with schizophrenia as academics, poets, women, eccentrics, and others who perhaps deviated from but remained largely within the norm. Schizophrenia often implied an illness of the white mind, end quote. He also called it a disease of white male genius. And in 1935, the New York Times described white writers and poets as having, quote, a propensity toward flowery prose believed to be one of the telltale phrases of schizophrenia, the mild form of insanity known as split personality, end quote. We now know that A, schizophrenia is not the same thing as what we used to call multiple personality disorder, and B, it is not a very mild form of insanity. It's part of a group we call severe and persistent mental illness. Anyway, I digress. Schizophrenia was also often referred to in newspapers and magazines as, quote, a personality disorder brought by the pressures of white civilization, end quote. And so we had women like Alice Wilson from a couple episodes ago who couldn't keep up with the pressures of their housework or raising children being diagnosed with schizophrenia. Men who were overly emotional or geniuses with flowery prose were also diagnosed with schizophrenia. It was seen as a disease of the passive and docile. It was recommended that patients diagnosed with schizophrenia were treated as if they were underdeveloped children. So staff worked with them on their social skills, vocational abilities, and physical exercise in order to promote the skills they would need in order to function in society. Dementia praecox, on the other hand, began to be associated with paranoia and crime, and ultimately with marginalized groups of people. Metzl points out that a 1915 forensic study showed that up to 60% of arrests and 15% of violent crimes involved praecoxial perpetrators. It makes sense then that in the 1910s and 1920s, newspapers began reporting on crimes committed by, quote, demented criminals, pointing to convicted criminals who were later diagnosed with dementia praecox. Some of the more publicized killers also happened to be Black, which served to perpetuate the stigma. Dementia praecox became the assigned diagnosis for many people of color. And just as a side note, some people today still use the word demented to be a synonym for like evil or perverse, when that was really, it's never its intended meaning. Research on race and mental illness during the 1920s and 1930s included terms like primitive and civilized to describe patient populations, which Metzl points out were codes. Primitive for Black or insane patients, and civilized for white or sane patients. Perhaps unsurprisingly, most research during this time period was conducted on white-only wards. Black patients were essentially left out of studies and left out of public awareness. Now, getting back to Ionia, the 1939 census at Ionia State Hospital offered a glimpse into the typical year of admissions demographics. There were 113 white men and 29 white women admitted that year, for a total of 142 white patients. That same year, 18 Black men and 3 Black women were admitted, for a total of 21 Black patients, or about 13% of the new patient admissions. At the same time period, most private mental health facilities still refused to take and accept Black patients, so they were sent to state hospitals instead. As an aside, we have to remember that Detroit, Michigan was going through a time of growth. Motor City was attracting laborers from around the U.S. to work for car manufacturing companies like Ford and General Motors. Many of these laborers were Black folks from the South, causing a rapid shift in the racial makeup of Michigan, but the Detroit area in particular. What was once an overwhelmingly white population steadily became more racially diverse. And just to give you a little bit of perspective, in 2013, the population of Michigan is approximately 77% white, 13% Black, and 10% everybody else. Metzl creates his own study about racial differences throughout time at Ionia State Hospital. He begins with this null hypothesis, quote, Ionia charts from the 1930s, 40s, and early 50s do not associate schizophrenia with racial violence in ways they would in later decades, end quote. If you're not familiar with null hypotheses, or if it's been a while since you've taken statistics, the null hypothesis is an idea that you assume is true until you prove it wrong. So Metzl is setting out on this study with the idea that earlier decades view schizophrenia one way, and later decades view it through a more racialized and violent lens. And he sets up his study in a way that seeks to either prove or disprove that idea. So what he does is he narrows the focus to patients diagnosed with schizophrenia between 1930 and 1950. He makes two groups, Black patients, white patients, and both groups have been diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he looks at how the hospital staff described these two groups of patients in their charts. And what he finds is interesting. Between 1930 and 1950, Black patients with schizophrenia are described as more restless, suspicious, and paranoid than white patients with schizophrenia. No surprise there. But equally as aggressive, hostile, and threatening as white patients. White patients were described as more depressed, confused, and cooperative than Black patients. By 1950, only 16% of the hospital population at Ionia was Black. By 1951, the major issue at the hospital wasn't related to race, it was overpopulation. There were 1,095 patients in 1951 in a facility that had a maximum capacity of 926. That year, there were 166 white patients admitted, 34 Black patients admitted, and 1 Indigenous patient admitted. You may remember in the last episode about Cesar Williams that he was an inmate at Jackson State Prison before he came to Ionia State Hospital. In 1952, there was a riot at the prison during which Cesar attempted to escape. He was caught and placed in solitary confinement for a year before being transferred to Ionia as a psychiatric inmate. And he wasn't alone. For several years after the riots at the prison, many former inmates were transferred to Ionia due to increased hostility and paranoia. Many of those former inmates were Black. Within 4 years following the riots, the overall population to Ionia had soared from 1,095 to 1,416. From 1954 to 1955, the admissions demographics had also changed considerably. During that time, there were 263 white patients admitted, 118 Black patients admitted, and 1 Indigenous patient admitted. You may remember that I mentioned that Black patients, both men and women, made up 16% of the overall population at Ionia in 1950. By 1956, so only 6 years later, Black men made up 40% of the population. By 1958, they made up nearly half. Obviously, this is a significant increase over the course of only 8 years. The entire population of Ionia was increasing as well. By 1960, there were 3,000 patients in the hospital, the most it ever saw. Despite adding new buildings, there just wasn't enough room for the sheer amount of people. This was the height of institutionalization, not only at Ionia, but in state hospitals around the US. And this should feel like a familiar refrain by now. Then came the Community Mental Health Act of 1963. and the push for deinstitutionalization. Around that same time, Ionia was having its own internal crisis. There had been a number of scandals around the hospital in the early 60s. 2 patients had died by suicide within weeks of one another, and a psychiatrist was found passed out drunk on the hospital grounds. An investigation looked into the treatment plans of all the patients and discovered that 987 patients were being housed after their expiration date and without legal justification. By 1965, the patient population had dropped to 1,501 patients. It's really challenging to talk about any era, but the 1960s in particular, because it was such a turbulent and revolutionary moment in US history. There are layers upon layers of major movements happening all at once. The civil rights movement, women's liberation, the Vietnam War, the Cold War, deinstitutionalization, the anti-psychiatry movement, to name only a few. And at the same time, these changes were happening at Ionia State Hospital and in state hospitals around the US. The civil rights movement was also front and center of everyone's attention. In the 1950s and early 1960s, many civil rights activists practiced peaceful nonviolence through boycotts and sit-ins and the like. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s infamous "I Have a Dream" speech took place in 1963. But people, and specifically white people in places of power, weren't really listening. Sure, there were some advancements made. Legislation passed the Civil Rights Acts of 1957, 1964, 1968, and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which promoted equality, at least in writing, but in practice, it was something vastly different. Metzl notes that in the aftermath of the Watts riots of 1965 in Los Angeles, there was a shift in the civil rights movement. It was clear that nonviolent protests weren't enough for things to really change for Black folks. Instead, this is when some activists became more determined, more militant, more revolutionary. Malcolm X was a spokesman for the Nation of Islam until his death in 1965. The Black Panther Party was formed in 1966, and more resistant groups formed to rally for Black rights. In Detroit, riots broke out in 1967 that resulted in 16 deaths and 493 people wounded. The era of Black power had arrived, and with it came a lot of fear from the majority demographic. The assassinations of Malcolm X in 1965 and Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968 brought the revolution to a head. 1968 was a chaotic year on many fronts, and there are entire college courses dedicated just to the year 1968 in the United States. So I can't even begin to cover it all here. For Black civil rights activists, their determination and steadfastness in the name of justice started to look a little like hostility and aggression and dangerousness to mental health professionals. And so we arrive at the namesake of Metzl's book, The Protest Psychosis. New York psychiatrists Walter Bromberg and Frank Simon coined the term protest psychosis, which they described as, quote, a condition which the rhetoric of the Black Power movement drove Negro men to insanity. They believed Black liberation movements literally caused delusions, hallucinations, and violent projections in Black men, end quote. Up to this point in the 1960s, the types of admissions to Ionia had even changed. Schizophrenia became the preferred diagnosis for the increasing number of Black male patients, including those, as Metzl points out, who had participated in Black Power protests or Detroit riots. Quote, Ionia diagnosed fully 88% of post-1960 U.S. Negro admissions, 96% of whom were men with schizophrenia, compared with only 44.6% of U.S. white admissions. Ionia doctors, nurses, and attendants also disproportionately described African American men with schizophrenia as being hostile or violent, end quote. And that would change even more when the second edition of the DSM was published in 1968. The writers of the text had hoped to create a more objective, better defined set of criteria for psychiatric disorders. Unfortunately, or at least in the case of schizophrenia, it did the opposite. In the last episode, we discussed the changes in the criteria for schizophrenia and the addition of paranoid schizophrenia in the DSM-2. I want to reread the definition of paranoid schizophrenia because it bears repeating, especially in the context of increasing Black admissions. So, schizophrenia, paranoid type. This type of schizophrenia is characterized primarily by the presence of persecutory or grandiose delusions, often associated with hallucinations. Excessive religiosity is sometimes seen. The patient's attitude is frequently hostile and aggressive, and his behavior tends to be consistent with his delusions. In general, the disorder does not manifest gross personality disorganization of the hebephrenic and catatonic types, perhaps because the patient manifests the mechanism of projection, which attributes to others characteristics he cannot accept in himself. 3 subtypes of the disorder may sometimes be differentiated depending on the predominant symptoms: hostile, grandiose, and hallucinatory, end quote. And because the new version of the DSM-2 used the symptoms of delusion, anger, hostility, and projection in the definition of paranoid schizophrenia, there began a shift in hospital demographics. Black protesters were arrested for hostile behavior. Once in jail or prison, they were diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. And once diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia, they were labeled insane and sent to a psychiatric hospital. If you recall near the beginning of the episode, I referenced a study that Jonathan Metzl conducted using chart information from Ionia. He looked at how Black and white patients were described by staff in 1935 to 1950. Both groups were viewed as equally aggressive and hostile, while Black patients appeared more paranoid and restless, and white patients appeared more confused and isolated. Metzl used the same research format to examine charts from 1960 to 1975. What he found was that 70% of Black male patients with schizophrenia were described as hostile, 65% as aggressive, and over 50% as suspicious and paranoid. During the same period, white male patients with schizophrenia were described as mostly depressed, cooperative, and withdrawn, and none of those traits breached 50%. So the data is showing that staff were describing Black patients as significantly more dangerous starting in the 60s than beforehand. It's unlikely that an entire demographic of people suddenly became dangerous all at once, so the culprit was likely something more insidious. White psychiatrists and psychologists were not immune to the fear caused by the civil rights movement and by Black power. It's entirely possible that their internal biases, perhaps even unrecognized by them, influenced the way they saw their patients. And suddenly, schizophrenia appeared dangerous. Black folks appeared dangerous. And schizophrenia became a Black disease. Metzl supports this, saying, quote, "It might well have appeared to Ionia psychiatrists that Black schizophrenia was a violent disorder, given the types of patients they saw at the hospital in the post-1968 period. But it would have been much more difficult for these doctors to recognize how policy decisions, changes in the legal system, urban decay, political crisis, and other factors effectively pre-selected African American patients with histories of violent crime in the first place, while eliminating patients without violent histories well before they arrived at the psychiatrist's door." As one example, Ionia became a receiving hospital for so-called forensic psychiatric cases in the mid-1960s. Forensic psychiatry was an emerging discipline that combined psychiatry and the law in order to address matters of criminal insanity, competency to stand trial, mental state at the time of the offense, and sentencing recommendations for mentally ill defendants. In the aftermath arrived increasing numbers of hardcore criminal patients who had histories that included robbery, homicide, and attacks on authority figures such as police. Ionia received forensic cases from prisons, lower security hospitals, other forensic centers such as Ypsilanti and urban Detroit, end quote. Metzl also pointed out that many of those transfers were Black folks who had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. Now, even the new psychotropic medications of the 1960s catered to this shift in population change. I'm going to attach the advertisements that I'm referencing to the Facebook group and the Instagram page so you can see how awful they are, but I'll also describe them here. There's an ad from the early 1970s depicting an angry Black man. He's painted in a way that kind of reminds me of Edvard Munch's The Scream. He has furrowed eyebrows, an open mouth with teeth bared, and his left hand is raised and balled into a fist. Above the image reads, "Assaultive and belligerent," and the next page reads, "Cooperation often begins with Haldol, a first choice for starting therapy." Some of you already know this, but I used to teach college writing for many years before I became a psychologist. And every term, I would have my students analyze an advertisement. Who was the audience? What is the purpose of the ad? Is the ad trying to make you feel something or teach you something or make you feel part of something? And as I looked at this ad, I found myself doing that same exercise. The intended audience is psychiatrists or other prescribers, but probably more specifically, non-Black psychiatrists, most likely white during this time period. It's trying to scare the viewer with this almost grotesque and aggressive person coming at them, as if the man is going to reach out and strike him with his fist. We must stop him, the ad seems to suggest. The implication here, obviously, is that Black men's rage is not only dangerous and pathological, but it needs to be chemically contained. Now, earlier I mentioned that the research articles in the 20s and 30s differentiated Black and white patient populations by labeling them as primitive and civilized. There were other advertisements from the early 70s for stelazine and thorazine that used African-themed primitive art to advertise the new drugs. The implication seems clear that these medications are aimed to treat uncivilized patients. It's certainly not aimed at someone of European heritage. And just as a comparison, Metzl included an ad from 1950s for Serpacil that featured two white women, one sewing, one just calmly reading a magazine, with the text, "Clean, cooperative, and communicative." Very different message there. The intent isn't to contain a hostile patient, but sort of more to maintain the status quo. And as the 1960s came to a close, there were fewer and fewer patients residing at Ionia. In 1968, the Criminal Sexual Psychopath Act was repealed, so many of Ionia's sex offenders were transferred to community treatment centers. That caused an additional decrease in the hospital population. By June 1969, there were 752 patients at Ionia. That number dropped to 409 patients by the end of September 1972 and to 343 patients by the end of June 1973. By 1976, only 200 patients remained. It was announced on September 4th, 1976, that the hospital would close the following year. And in November 1977, the hospital closed and the Department of Corrections took over in its stead. There was a complete turnover of administration, staff, and patients. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is really just a crash course on this information. If you weren't familiar with or aware of the connection between race and what I would consider unfair psychiatric diagnoses, I encourage you to read Jonathan Metzl's book, The Protest Psychosis. I also encourage you to read The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And even though I haven't read it yet, though it's been highly recommended to me and is on my Audible list right now, the book Insane by Elisa Roth. These books delve more into the history of race, mental health, and imprisonment, and they're definitely worth a read. Similarly, I also think it's worth mentioning some other information about our prison system because psychiatric hospitals and prisons can be so intertwined. In 1974, there were 218,000 people locked up in state and federal prisons around the United States. In 2000, that number grew to over 1.3 million. I certainly have opinions and support for why that number increased exponentially. It's another equally complex and complicated answer, but certainly one worth diving into. I'm sure there are other podcasters who can more effectively speak on the issue of over-incarceration in the United States than I can, because my area of expertise lies within psychiatric hospitals and mental illness in particular. So with that, I'm going to wrap up the story of Ionia State Hospital. Like I mentioned at the beginning of this series, I have been really looking forward to this. We're going to start a new hospital next week, so get ready to head back to the East Coast. And also, I just want to say that I appreciate you all so much. Thank you for listening. Thank you for joining the Facebook group. Thank you for supporting me monthly. Heather, I see you. And if you want to help me out like Heather is, feel free to contribute to the Buzzsprout page. It helps me pay for the monthly production costs. If you haven't done so already, please rate and review the show wherever you're listening, but especially if you're listening on Apple Podcasts. I would love to read your review. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, funny jokes, feel free to reach out by email at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can also connect with me in the Facebook group, Behind the Walls Podcast. And as always, do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. Until next time. Thank you so much for listening to Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Once again, I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Gallup. Cover image is by Christopher Payne. Check out my website at behindthewallspodcast.buzzsprout.com. Follow the podcast and learn more on Facebook at Behind the Walls Podcast and Instagram at Behind the Walls Pod. For questions or recommendations, email me at behindthewallspodcast@gmail.com. You can find new episodes every Monday on Amazon Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you're listening right now. If you like the show, please rate, review, and subscribe on Apple Podcasts. It helps other people find and listen to the show, and I would be so grateful. Please stay tuned for more episodes of Behind the Walls of the World Psychiatric Hospitals. Until next time.